She stepped off that train with a violin case, two heavy trunks, and the kind of look in her eyes that told you she'd already decided she wasn't impressed. He stood on the platform like a man who'd ordered livestock and received a hurricane instead. Nobody in Broken Creek thought that marriage would last a week. They were wrong. What happened between Callum Voss and Elise Faulkner over the next 3 years would reshape every ranch in the Northern Territory and nearly kill them both in the process. If you've ever built something real from nothing, this story is for you. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and let's begin. The morning Callum Voss drove his wagon to the Broken Creek station. The sky looked exactly the way it had looked every single morning for the past 11 years he'd lived in Dakota Territory. Flat, pale, indifferent. The kind of sky that didn't care whether you lived or died beneath it. The kind that had watched 3 of his neighbors pack up and leave without a word, had watched 2 more get buried in the frozen ground east of town, and had never once changed its expression. Callum had stopped expecting things from the sky a long time ago. He tied the horses at the post near the water trough and checked his pocket watch. The train from Bismarck was due in 40 minutes. He had 40 minutes to stand next to a wooden platform in 30-degree wind and think about what he'd done. What he'd done was write a letter to an agency called Heartland Arrangements out of Chicago, Illinois. He'd paid $12 for the privilege, filled out a form that asked him to describe what he was looking for in a wife the same way a man might describe what he was looking for in a plow horse. Age, constitution, willingness to work. And then he'd waited 4 months for a response. The response had been a single-paragraph letter from a woman named Elise Faulkner, currently residing in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, formerly of somewhere in Germany. The letter was polite, somewhat formal, and contained exactly one sentence that should have warned him. I am not a woman who does well with silence, Mr. Voss, so I hope you are prepared for conversation. Callum had read that sentence twice, folded the letter back into its envelope, and told himself it didn't matter. He needed someone who could keep the house, help with accounts, maybe cook something that wasn't salt pork and hardtack. He wasn't looking for a companion. He was looking for a practical arrangement. That was what he told himself standing next to that water trough. He almost believed it. Broken Creek was not a town that inspired confidence. It had a general store, a saloon, a Lutheran church with a cracked bell, a livery stable that smelled considerably worse than it should have, and about 240 people who had collectively decided that enduring the Dakota winters was preferable to admitting defeat and going somewhere warmer. The people were tough the way old leather gets tough. Cracked in places, not especially pretty, but they held together. They also talked constantly about everyone else's business. By the time Callum had been standing at the station for 20 minutes, 3 separate people had found reasons to be nearby. Old Henriksen, who ran the feed store, materialized at the edge of the platform, pretending to inspect a fence post that had not needed inspecting in living memory. He nodded at Callum without speaking, which was the Dakota version of a warm greeting. Martha Sykes, whose husband ran the livery, walked past 3 times on her way to nowhere in particular, each time glancing at Callum's wagon with the specific expression of a woman cataloging information she intended to distribute later. And then there was Jorgen Halt, who was 22 years old, worked at the grain elevator, and had absolutely no instinct for subtlety. He walked straight up to Callum and said, "Heard you got yourself a male bride coming in today." Callum looked at him for a moment. "Where'd you hear that?" "Mrs. Sykes." "And where'd she hear it?" Jorgen considered this. "Don't rightly know. But is it true?" "It's my business," Callum said, which in Broken Creek translated to yes. Jorgen nodded thoughtfully, leaning against the post. "What's she like?" "I don't know. I've never met her." "What do you know about her?" Callum pulled his coat tighter against the wind. "She's German. She plays violin." Jorgen absorbed this information with visible concern. "Violin," he repeated. "That's what I said. Out here." Jorgen looked at the flat gray plains extending in every direction with the particular blankness that the northern frontier did so well. There was nothing sentimental about that landscape. It was simply enormous and cold and completely uninterested in violin music. "Out here," Callum confirmed. Jorgen shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he can already see how something is going to go wrong and doesn't want to be impolite about it. "Well," he said finally, "good luck to you, Mr. Voss." He walked away. Callum watched him go, and for just a moment, one moment he would never have admitted to anyone, He thought that Jorgen Halt might have a point. Then the train whistle sounded in the distance, and Callum straightened his coat, and whatever doubts he had went somewhere small and quiet, where he didn't have to look at them. The train pulled in with the usual sound and fury, steam billowing out across the platform in thick white clouds that smelled of coal smoke and hot metal. Passengers descended in the ordinary way: a merchant with sample cases, two farm families with too much luggage, a man in a suit who looked immediately and correctly alarmed by his surroundings. Callum watched each person come down the steps. He was looking for a woman traveling alone, probably carrying more luggage than was practical, probably looking uncertain. He did not see anyone who looked uncertain. What he saw instead, stepping off the second-to-last car with the focused energy of someone executing a plan, was a woman of perhaps 28 years old, carrying a violin case in one hand and directing a porter toward two extremely large trunks with the other. She was not tall, but she held herself as though she were, which amounted to roughly the same thing. Her coat was good quality but worn at the elbows. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up in a practical way that still managed to look like a deliberate decision. And she was speaking rapidly to the flustered porter in a voice that cut cleanly through the noise of the platform. "The larger trunk. Careful with that side, please. There are books along the bottom, and if you crack the spine of the Brower volume, I will be genuinely upset. Yes, that side. The left side. I just said—" She turned from the porter mid-sentence, scanned the platform with the quick assessing look of someone who had arrived in strange places before and knew how to get their bearings, and her eyes landed on Callum Voss. I was admittedly not hard to identify. He was the only man on the platform standing completely still, watching her with the expression of someone trying to solve an equation. She walked toward him directly. No hesitation. The violin case swung at her side. "Mr. Voss," she said when she reached him. It wasn't quite a question. "Miss Faulkner," he said. "Elise," she corrected. She looked at him steadily, not unkindly, but with a thoroughness that he found slightly unsettling, as though she was making an assessment that she intended to stand behind later. Her eyes were a dark gray-green, which was not a color he'd been expecting, and they had a sharpness to them that he recognized from certain animals. Not mean sharpness, but the kind that meant nothing much got past her. "All right," he said. "Elise." A pause. The steam from the train continued to drift between them. "You look more serious than your letter suggested," she said. "My letter was 6 lines." "Yes." She tilted her head slightly. "And still you managed to seem less severe in writing than you do in person. That's actually somewhat impressive." Callum looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them smiled, but for entirely different reasons. He, because he had not smiled easily in years, and she, he would come to understand, because she was concentrating too hard on reading him to spare the expression. "The wagon's this way," he said. "I have 2 trunks." "I see that." "They're heavy." "I have a wagon." She considered him for another moment, then nodded once, briskly, like someone accepting terms they've decided are workable, and turned back to direct the porter. Behind her, Callum caught Martha Sykes watching from across the platform with an expression that he recognized as the precise mixture of fascination and disaster anticipation that would guarantee this scene would be retold in every kitchen in Broken Creek before dark. He picked up the violin case that Elise had set down to manage the trunks and carried it to the wagon. The ride out to the Voss Ranch was 11 miles. It took the better part of 2 hours because the trail had frozen and thawed and frozen again in alternating weeks, and was in a state of corrugated misery that the wagon absorbed with every inch of its old suspension. Elise sat on the bench beside Callum, with her hands in her lap, and watched the landscape unfold around them. For the first 20 minutes, she said nothing. He thought with cautious relief that perhaps she had been exaggerating about the conversation. Then she said, "How much land?" 1,200 acres. "How many head?" 340, roughly. Some calves not counted yet. "How many hands?" 2 full-time, 2 seasonal. She nodded, processing this. "What broke?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Beg your pardon?" "On the ranch. Something's broken, or you wouldn't have written to an agency. Men who are doing well don't look for help. What's the weak point?" The question was so direct that he took a moment to respond. Not because he didn't know the answer, he knew it exactly, but because he wasn't used to being asked that question by anyone, let alone by a woman he'd met 40 minutes ago. "Storage," he said finally. "Hay losses in winter are bad. The storage sheds are old and two of them let in weather. Lost too much feed last 2 winters. How old? The sheds? 15, 18 years? Wood rot or foundation? Both, mostly. She was quiet for another stretch. The wagon lurched over a particularly bad section of trail, and she braced against the benchboard without comment. Then, what about accounts? Do you keep them yourself? I do. Current or behind? Current. Livestock records? In a ledger. Complete back to the start. She said it the way someone says HM when they've confirmed a suspicion but aren't ready to name it yet. What do you grow? Grass for grazing, small kitchen garden, nothing beyond that. Winter crops? This is Dakota. I know where we are, Mr. Voss. I asked about winter crops. He looked at her again. She was still watching the landscape, her profile steady against the gray horizon. Nobody grows winter crops out here, he said. People say that about a lot of things that other people then go and do, she replied simply, and that was all she said on the subject for the rest of the ride. The Voss Ranch sat in a long, shallow valley between two lines of low hills, the kind of placement that was practical rather than scenic, sheltered from the worst of the north wind but exposed enough to get proper drainage when the snowmelt came. The main house was solid, built from good timber, not beautiful, but genuinely substantial. Two outbuildings sat back from it, and behind those the corrals and the barn, and beyond that the land rolled out toward the hills in every direction, with a completeness that could feel like either freedom or loneliness, depending on who you were and what day it was. Elise got down from the wagon before Callum could come around to help her. She stood in the yard and looked at the property the way she'd looked at him at the station, directly, thoroughly, making a record. The shed on the left, she said. That's one of the broken ones? Yes. The roof slope is wrong. Water's pooling and coming back under instead of running off. That's probably your rot source. She walked toward it, not asking permission, just going. Callum tied the horses and followed, mostly because it was his property, and he felt he ought to. She walked around the shed completely, crouching at the base to look at where the boards met the foundation, tilting her head to sight along the roof line. It's fixable, she said, standing up. Not cheap, but fixable. The other one worse or better? About the same. What lumber do you have on hand? Some. Not enough. There a mill within reasonable distance? 40 miles. She nodded. Then she turned and looked at the house for a long moment. Can I see inside? It was a strange thing, being asked permission to enter a house that was, by the arrangement they'd made, now partly hers. He said yes, and she went inside, and he stood in the yard for a moment alone with his horses and the wind and the peculiar feeling that his ranch, which he had understood completely for 11 years, had just become a different place. She found 3 things wrong with the house in the first hour. The first was structural, a corner of the root cellar door that didn't seal properly and was letting cold air in under the kitchen floor all winter. She demonstrated this by putting her hand flat on the floorboards and looking up at him with one eyebrow slightly raised, and he had to admit that yes, the floor in that corner was always colder than the rest. And no, he hadn't known why. The second was organizational. The supply storage was arranged by size of container rather than by frequency of use, which meant the things he needed most often were at the back behind things he needed almost never. She didn't criticize this directly. She just looked at the arrangement for a while and then said, "Who organized this?" And when he said, "I did," she said, "I see," in a tone that was technically neutral. The third was the bookshelf, or rather, the absence of one. She opened a trunk and pulled out perhaps 30 books, a number he hadn't anticipated, though perhaps he should have given the weight of those trunks, and looked around the main room for somewhere to put them and found nothing suitable. The books went back in the trunk. She looked at the walls thoughtfully. "Do you have any spare planking?" she asked. "For what?" "A shelf. Several, ideally." He looked at the wall she was looking at, which was bare and solid, and as far as he'd ever been concerned, a perfectly adequate wall. "I have some boards in the workshop." "Good." She turned away from the wall. "I'll manage my own things tonight. I don't need anything." A pause. "Thank you for the room." The room in question was small, with one window facing east and a bed that was serviceable but not comfortable. He'd made it up with clean sheets because he'd known someone was coming, which was more effort than it sounds given that clean sheets required hauling and heating water, and he'd done it without particularly thinking about why. "It's not much," he said from the doorway. "It's enough," she said. She was unpacking the second trunk with the systematic efficiency of someone who had moved before and knew how to make order in a strange place. She didn't look at him. "You don't need to check on me, Mr. Voss. I'll be fine." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he said, "Good night," and went to see to the horses, and the house behind him was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet before. Not empty quiet, but occupied quiet, which was an entirely different thing, and one he hadn't felt in a very long time. The town made its opinion known within days. Broken Creek was not a cruel place, but it had the characteristic small-town habit of measuring everyone against the standard of what had worked before, and what had worked before in Dakota Territory was a specific kind of woman, quiet, practical, durable, willing to subordinate herself to the demands of the land. Women who complained didn't last. Women who had opinions about things beyond their immediate domestic sphere were regarded with gentle suspicion. Women who arrived with 30 books and a violin and immediately started examining the structural integrity of your outbuildings were something the town had not previously developed a category for. They tried a few categories and found them all imperfect. "Educated," said Martha Sykes, which in her mouth meant something more complicated than the word itself. "Doesn't know her place," said Niels Bergstrom, who ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, and had strong views about what women's places were. "Strange," said several people, which was the most honest assessment and therefore the most common one. Elise met the town's opinion with a quality that Callum observed carefully and could only describe as she simply didn't adjust herself for it. She was not rude. She was not defiant in any theatrical way. She went to the general store and talked to the proprietor about supply pricing with enough knowledge of current market rates that he gave her better terms than he'd given Callum in years. She attended the Lutheran church because she said it was practical to be on civil terms with the community, and she sang the hymns in German because that was the language she knew them in, and she shook hands with the minister afterward and thanked him for a decent sermon. And if the congregation found any of this unusual, she gave no sign of caring. What she could not do at first was ride. This was the first real crack, the first thing that the frontier found and pushed against, the way it pushed against everything eventually, looking for where you'd break. She could manage a horse at a walking pace. She told him, honestly, in those first days when they were still establishing the practical terms of how this arrangement was going to function. "I rode some in Milwaukee. I am not a strong rider. I'll learn what I need to learn." And he'd said with equal honesty, "You need to be able to ride well enough to manage alone if I'm out with the cattle. That's a basic requirement out here." "Then teach me," she said. So he did. Or he tried. The trouble was that Elise approached a horse the way she approached everything, with her mind, with logic, with an absolute certainty that if she understood the correct principles, the execution would follow. And the horse was not interested in principles. The horse was a 10-year-old roan mare named Clara, who had her own opinions and communicated them physically. The first 3 lessons ended with Elise on the ground, not dramatically. No real danger, just the ordinary consequence of an inexperienced rider and an opinionated horse. But the ground is the ground, and it's made of frozen dirt, and it is not comfortable. The third time she went down, she sat in the dirt for a moment, and Callum watched from the fence and saw her hands tighten in the cold grass, and for just a second he thought she might cry. She didn't. She made a sound that was not a word in any language he knew, but was unmistakably an expression of pure frustration, got back to her feet, and walked straight back to Clara without dusting herself off. "Elise," he said, "I'm fine. Your wrist is fine." She gathered the reins again, her jaw set. "Tell me what I'm doing wrong." He looked at her for a moment. The dirt on her skirt, the way she was holding herself carefully because her wrist was not in fact fine, and said, "You're fighting her instead of sitting with her. You're thinking too hard. Stop trying to be correct and just—" He searched for the word. "Just be on the horse. Like you belong there, whether she agrees or not." She looked at him with an expression that suggested this advice was insufficiently technical. "That's not instruction. That's philosophy. Sometimes they're the same thing." She stared at him. He stared back. Clara stood between them, switching her tail. Then very slowly, something in Elise's face shifted. Not quite a smile, but close. Not agreement exactly, but recognition. "I hate that you might be right," she said. She got back on the horse, and this time she stopped fighting. She didn't fall again that day. The weeks built on each other in that incremental way that time moves when you're occupied. Not fast, not slow, just continuous, each day adding to the last like snow accumulating on flat ground. Elise fixed the root cellar seal in the first week, using materials she found in the workshop and a method she said she'd learned from watching a carpenter in Milwaukee fix a similar problem. The kitchen floor stopped being cold in that corner. Callum noticed, but said nothing. She reorganized the supply storage in the second week. He came in one morning to find everything rearranged with a logic he would not have predicted but could not argue with. The things he used daily at the front, the things he used seasonally at the back, and a written inventory sheet tacked to the inside of the door that listed everything on the shelves with a precision he'd never bothered with. He stood in front of that inventory sheet for a long moment. "You didn't ask," he said when he found her. "You didn't prohibit," she replied, not looking up from the account books she'd asked to review, and was now going through with a sharpness pencil and an expression of focused disapproval. "Is there something wrong with those books?" "There's nothing wrong with the bookkeeping," she said carefully. "The numbers are accurate. The categories, though—" She paused, turning a page. "You're losing money on the hay every other year in a pattern that suggests you're buying at the wrong time of the supply cycle. If you bought earlier in the summer, before the autumn demand drives prices up, you'd save—" She did a brief calculation in the margin. "Roughly $60 to $80 a year, depending on the year." He sat down across from her. "How do you know the supply cycle?" "I read." She looked at him finally. "Agricultural journals, immigrant farming circulars. I've been reading them for 2 years since I knew I was likely to end up somewhere like this." She paused. "I wanted to understand what I was getting into." He looked at her for a moment. "Did you think you'd end up in Dakota specifically?" "I thought I'd end up somewhere hard," she said, and there was something in her voice, not self-pity, nothing like that, something more like plainness, the flatness of someone stating a fact they've already made their peace with. "The agency sent me your listing, and I thought, this man is not lying about what he wants. He's not pretending it will be comfortable. He is at least being honest." She looked back down at the books. "I decided I'd rather have honesty than promises." He didn't respond to that, but he sat there a while longer, watching her work through his accounts with her sharpness pencil, and thought about what she'd said, and didn't entirely disagree with her reasoning. The first shelf went up in the third week. He built it himself, on a Sunday afternoon when the wind was too bad for outdoor work, using the planks he had in the workshop and a pattern he figured out from looking at what he had and what would fit on the wall. It was not elegant. The edges weren't finished, the proportions were slightly off, and he wasn't entirely certain it was level. He put it up anyway, and when Elise came in from the barn where she'd been helping sort supplies and saw it on the wall, rough and unbeautiful and solid, she stopped walking and just looked at it for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You needed somewhere to put the books." "I could have managed." "They were still in the trunk," he said. "Books shouldn't be in trunks." She turned to look at him with the particular expression she sometimes wore when she was reassessing something. He didn't know this yet, that this was what she was doing, but he would come to recognize it. Then she went to the trunk and began unpacking the books, and she arranged them on the shelf with the same systematic care she brought to everything. And when the shelf was full, she stood back and looked at it with a quiet satisfaction that she didn't try to hide. "It needs 2 more, she said. "At least." "I know," he said. She played the violin for the first time 3 weeks after she arrived. He'd come in late from a fence repair and she didn't know he was in the yard yet, and through the window he could hear it. Not a melody he recognized, something careful and slow, like she was finding her way back to something she'd been away from for a while. It wasn't polished. She stopped twice and started over, and the second time she started over, he could hear the frustration in the way she reapproached the passage, pushing through it differently. He stood in the yard in the cold for longer than was sensible, listening. When he came inside, she stopped playing immediately and set the violin down as though he'd caught her doing something she wasn't sure she was allowed to do. He took off his coat and didn't say anything about it. And the next evening, when he came in and she was playing again, she only glanced at him once, briefly, and kept playing. He sat in his chair by the fire and read his Cattlemen's Association correspondence. And she played, and the house was quiet around both of them in a way that was not uncomfortable. He didn't tell her it was good because he didn't know enough about violin playing to say so honestly. But he didn't ask her to stop, which for a man who had lived in silence for 11 years was a more significant statement than it might have appeared. The community's opinion began to shift in the 5th week, the day Elise attended the Halverson Cattle Drive. She hadn't been invited exactly. The Halverson family, whose land bordered the south edge of Callum's property, needed extra hands for a drive to move 200 head to winter pasture. And Callum was going, and Elise had said the night before, with the tone of someone reporting a decision already made, "I'll come." He'd looked at her. "It's a cattle drive." "Yes. You've mentioned you're short-handed in autumn." "It's not—" He stopped. "It's hard work. It's 2 days." "I know what a cattle drive is, Mr. Voss." "Do you?" "Largely from reading," she admitted. "But the principle is straightforward." The principle, as it turned out, was considerably more straightforward than the execution. A cattle drive is noise and dust and animals that do not want to go where you want them to go, and horses that are tired and riders that are tired, and mud and cold, and the specific misery of sleeping on the ground in October in Dakota, when the temperature drops 40 degrees after sunset. Elise kept up. It was not graceful, and it was not effortless. She was cold in a way she couldn't hide after the first night, and her horse had a bad day, and she had 3 near falls that she recovered from through sheer stubbornness rather than skill. And by the second day she was riding with her jaw set in a way that suggested several things hurt that she was not going to mention. But she kept up, and at the end of the second day, when they'd gotten the herd to winter pasture, and old man Halverson was handing out whiskey from a flask, in the way of men who've finished hard work together, he handed it to Elise without comment, and she took a pull without ceremony. And he nodded at her the way he'd nodded at the other men, which was his highest form of social recognition. On the ride back, one of the Halversons' ranch hands, a young man named Decker, who'd spent the whole drive being conspicuously unimpressed, pulled his horse alongside Callum's and said quietly, "She's not what I expected." "No," Callum said. "She's not." He didn't say it like a complaint. What was building between them was not simple, and it was not fast, and neither of them named it. What it was, in the practical terms they both moved in, was this. They had developed a habit of talking after supper. Not about anything in particular. About the ranch, about what needed doing, about what Elise had read and found interesting, about the neighbors and the town. He wasn't a conversational man by nature, and he knew it, and sometimes she carried more of it than was fair, but she didn't seem to mind the uneven weight. She'd say something, and he'd think about it and say something back eventually. And she'd gotten used to the pauses and stopped filling them, which he appreciated more than he found words for. He'd also built the second shelf, and then the third. And one evening she'd been playing the violin and had stopped mid-passage and said, without looking up from her music, "Does it bother you, the noise?" "No," he said. "You can tell me if it does." "I just told you it doesn't." She glanced up at him, then back at the music. "All right." She resumed playing, and he resumed reading, and neither of them said anything more, but the room felt different than it had before she'd asked. Warmer, maybe, or just more settled, the way a house feels when everyone in it has stopped being careful with each other for a moment. He noticed things about her that he hadn't expected to notice. The way she thought out loud when she was working through a problem. Not asking for input, just following the logic aloud, which was a habit he recognized because he'd done the same thing once, before silence became his default. The way she defended her opinions with complete calm, never getting louder, never getting harder, just more precise. The way she'd adapted to the physical demands of the ranch with a consistency that wasn't heroic, just determined. She was still cold on the early morning chores, still clumsy on certain kinds of horses, still making rookie mistakes with the livestock. But she kept showing up, and she kept adjusting, and she never asked for credit for it. He didn't give her credit for it either, which he would later understand was not the same as not seeing it. And she had thoughts about the ranch that were better than his, and she was right about the hay purchasing cycle. And when she proposed a winter crop experiment using seed varieties she'd sourced through the Agricultural Journal, small scale, she said, "We'll see what takes before we commit to real acreage." He said yes, mostly because her argument was solid, and maybe partly because he'd gotten used to the sound of her thinking out loud, and was curious where it was going to lead. The night at first became complicated. The night the practical arrangement started fraying at its edges and something else started showing through was an ordinary night in November. They'd had a difficult day. One of the full-time hands had come down sick, a section of fencing on the north pasture had come down in the wind, and a heifer had calved early, and the calf was weak, and they'd both spent most of the afternoon trying to keep it alive in the barn. The calf had survived, finally, though it was still uncertain. They'd come in after dark, both of them tired and cold and covered in the particular kind of mess that livestock emergencies produce. Elise was at the stove and Callum was at the table, and neither of them was talking, and the fire was going, and the house smelled of coffee, and something she had cooking, and for a long moment, just a moment, Callum looked up from his hands at the back of her, at the way she moved in the kitchen with the same focused efficiency she moved everywhere, and felt something that was not practical at all. He looked back down before she turned around. "The calf will be all right," she said. She sounded less certain than her words. "Probably," he said. "We did what we could." She put the coffee on the table. She sat down across from him. They were both too tired to maintain the careful distances they'd been keeping, and she sat with her elbows on the table in a way she wouldn't have if she wasn't tired, and he looked at her face. The smudge of something on her jaw she hadn't noticed, the tiredness around her eyes, the fact that she was still here, still present, after a day that would have discouraged most people, and the thing he felt sat in his chest like a stone that hadn't been there before. "You should clean that," he said, indicating his own jaw to show her where the smudge was. She reached up, didn't quite get it. "Did I?" "Little to the right," he said. Then, "Here." He reached across the table without thinking and wiped it away himself, with his thumb, the way you do for a child, or for someone you're not being careful around anymore. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds. He pulled his hand back and she sat very still for a moment, looking at the table, and the kitchen was very quiet. "Thank you," she said. "Sorry," he said, which he hadn't meant to say. She looked up at him. Her expression was unreadable, and then, for just a second, it wasn't. Something passed across it that was clear and uncomplicated and gone almost immediately, replaced by her usual composure. "Don't be," she said quietly. And she picked up her coffee and drank it, and they sat there in the firelight and said nothing else. And outside the Dakota wind moved across the plains with its usual total indifference. But the room was different than it had been an hour before. And Callum Voss, who had spent 11 years becoming comfortable with silence, found himself sitting in it and wanting, for the first time in a very long time, to say something. He just hadn't figured out yet what it was. The morning after the kitchen incident, Callum was up before first light the way he always was, and when he came downstairs, Elise was already at the stove. That was new. In the first week, she'd been slow to mornings, needing time to find her footing in the cold dark of a Dakota dawn. But somewhere in the past month, she'd started waking earlier, adjusting to the rhythm of the ranch the way water adjusts to the shape of whatever holds it. Not fighting the shape, just filling it. Neither of them mentioned the night before. There was coffee on the table, and she handed him a cup when he sat down and said, "The north fence repair. I can help with that today if you need another hand." And he said, "All right," and that was the whole of it. Whatever had passed between them in the firelight stayed where it was, unexamined, and both of them moved around it with the careful instinct of people who've learned that some things collapse if you look at them too directly. What Callum noticed, though, and tried not to notice, and noticed anyway, was that she poured his coffee without asking how he took it, because she already knew. 3 weeks ago, she hadn't known. He wasn't sure exactly when she'd learned, and that bothered him in a way he couldn't entirely account for. The fence repair took most of the morning. The section that had come down was a full 30 yards along the north pasture border, post pulled sideways by the wind, wire tangled in a way that required patience and cold hands, and the specific kind of low profanity that fencing work produces in even the mildest tempered men. Callum worked one end and Elise worked the other, and his ranch hand Peterson, who had recovered from his illness and returned that morning looking somewhat hollow around the eyes, worked the middle section and did not say much, which suited everyone. Elise had cut her hands twice by mid-morning. Not badly, but the wire was sharp and her gloves were not adequate for the work, and she knew it and kept going anyway. He saw the blood on the right glove when she came to collect more staples from the post bag, and he said, "Your hand," and she looked at it with the mildly irritated expression of someone who has noticed a problem and already decided it isn't going to stop them. "It's not deep," she said. "Let me see." "It's fine, Callum." It was the first time she'd used his given name without the Mr. Voss in front of it. Neither of them pointed this out. He took her hand anyway and looked at the cut. She was right. It wasn't deep, but it was raw, and the cold wasn't helping. And he wrapped it with the spare cloth he kept in his coat pocket for exactly this kind of thing. And she stood there and let him do it without pulling away. "You need better gloves," he said. "I know. I'll get them at Haskell's next time we're in town. I have a spare pair in the workshop." "Then I'll get them from the workshop." He let go of her hand. She went back to the fence. He watched her for a moment. The set of her shoulders, the way she attacked the tangled wire with a focus that did not concede the difficulty of the task. And then he went back to his own section and didn't say anything else. That afternoon, while she was inside making notes on the winter crop experiment she'd started, small rows of cold-tolerant rye along the protected south slope of the garden, still theoretical at this point, more soil preparation than actual planting. He went to the workshop and found the spare gloves and left them on the kitchen table. He was outside splitting wood when she found them. She came to the door and held them up. "Thank you," she said. "They were just sitting there," he said, and swung the axe. She went back inside, and he heard nothing more about it, but the next morning the gloves were on her hands when she came out for early chores, and that was all that needed to be said. The town, meanwhile, had not finished forming its opinion. The thing about Broken Creek was that it processed new information slowly and collectively, the way a jury deliberates, gathering evidence over time, comparing notes in kitchens and at the feed store counter, and eventually reaching a verdict that then became the fixed position until new evidence arrived. The verdict on Elise Faulkner, Elise Voss now, technically, though she still signed letters E. Faulkner out of a habit she hadn't broken, was still being deliberated. The cattle drive had moved some people. Old Halverson's nod of acknowledgement had weighed in the valley, and the story had circulated. But there was still a contingent, led in spirit, if not in name, by Niels Bergstrom, who felt that a woman who spoke her mind as freely as Elise did was a problem waiting to become a public problem, and that Callum Voss had made a mistake he hadn't fully reckoned with yet. Bergstrom made this view known to Callum directly. One afternoon in November, outside the general store, in the roundabout way that men in that community made uncomfortable things known, not stating them outright, but constructing a conversation around them until the point was unavoidable. "Heard your wife's been talking to the Marin family about their pasture drainage," Bergstrom said. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades looking across open land into the wind. "She has," Callum said. He was loading supplies into the wagon and did not stop. "Didn't know she was in the business of giving ranching advice." "She's not in a business. She was talking to neighbors. Young Lars Marin's been ranching that land since his father died. He doesn't need a woman who's been here 3 months telling him what's wrong with his drainage." Callum set down the sack of flour he was holding and looked at Bergstrom. "Did Lars Marin complain to you?" A pause. "Not in so many words." "Then it seems like Lars Marin's capable of deciding what he needs himself." He picked up the flour again. "Anything else?" Bergstrom's jaw tightened. "I'm just saying, Voss, you let her run too loose, she'll cause problems with people who've been here a lot longer than she has. This isn't Milwaukee." "I know where it is," Callum said. "I've lived here longer than you have." He finished loading the wagon without looking at Bergstrom again and drove home, and when Elise asked him that evening if something had happened in town, because she'd learned to read the set of his shoulders by then, which she would not have been able to do 2 months ago, he said, "Bergstrom thinks you give too much advice." She was quiet for a moment. "Is he right?" "No," he said, with a flatness that surprised him. Lars Marin's drainage problem was visible from the road. If you saw a solution, you were right to say so. She looked at him across the table. "You didn't think that when I arrived, about the storage shed." "I didn't say it was right. It still was." The faint thing that passed across her face then was not quite a smile, but it was in that direction. She looked down at her book. "I'll try to be less obvious about it," she said. "Don't," he said. She looked up. "You see something, say it," he said. "This valley has been doing the same things wrong for 20 years because nobody says anything. That's not a virtue, it's just stubbornness." She was quiet for long enough that he thought the conversation was over. Then she said softly, "I wasn't sure you felt that way." "I do," he said. And that was all he said, but it was enough, and the table between them felt smaller than it had before. December arrived with the matter-of-fact brutality that Dakota reserved for that month. The temperature dropped steadily through the first 2 weeks, the sky went the color of old pewter, and the wind shifted into a steady northwest bearing that meant it had decided on a direction and was not going to be argued with. The ranch contracted inward, less outdoor work possible, more maintenance, more repair, more of the indoor labor that accumulated through the kinder months. The cattle were moved to winter pasture. The hay reserves, purchased earlier than usual on Elise's recommendation at a price that was going to save them roughly $70, were stacked in the repaired sheds whose roofs now ran water correctly. She had been right about the roofs. She'd been right about the hay. She'd been right about the root cellar seal and the supply organization and the drainage issue on the east side of the barn that Callum had been meaning to address for 2 years, and that Elise had fixed herself one Saturday in October without telling him she was going to do it, using a method she'd read about in an Austrian farming manual that he'd never heard of. He'd come out and found her knee-deep in mud, redirecting water flow with a hand-cut channel, and stood there watching her for a moment before saying, "I was going to do that." She looked up from the mud. "When?" "When I had time." "You had time in September." "I had other things in September." "You had other things every month for however long this has been a problem," she said, not unkindly, but with the precision of a woman who had looked at his methods and identified the pattern. "You're a man who fixes the things that break loudly. The quiet problems you leave alone." He'd thought about that for the rest of the day. And the day after. She wasn't wrong. He knew she wasn't wrong. But being known that specifically by someone he'd met 3 months ago was disorienting in a way that the physical demands of the frontier never were. The land could knock you down, and that made sense. It was the land. It was supposed to knock you down. But to be read clearly, accurately, by another person, to have someone look at you and see the actual pattern of how you operated rather than the image you'd been presenting, that was something else. I was still working out how to feel about it. The winter crop experiment, against most reasonable expectations, was showing results. The rye she'd planted along the south slope had germinated in the protected soil, thin green lines pushing up through the cold ground in a way that Callum looked at every few days with an expression that was partly skepticism and partly something that was trying not to become hope. The scale was small. It was always going to be small the first year. That was the agreement. But the fact of it, the simple existence of green in November in Dakota, felt like an argument being made in a language the land didn't usually speak. "They might not make it through the hard weeks," she said one morning when they were both crouched over the rows looking at the growth. Her breath came out in small clouds. "I want to be honest about that. This is first-year information, that's all. We're learning what the soil does." "But they're up," he said. "They're up," she agreed. He looked at the green lines for another moment. Then, "How'd you know it would work?" "I didn't," she said simply. "I knew it had worked in similar climates in other places, and that the soil conditions here were comparable. That's not the same as knowing." She looked at him. "Most things worth trying aren't certain." He absorbed that. "Is that from one of your books?" "No," she said. "That one's mine." He looked at her face, the cold in her cheeks, the straightforward honesty in her expression, the particular quality she had of meaning exactly what she said and nothing else, and felt the stone in his chest shift the way stones shift when water gets underneath them. He stood up and went back to the barn before she could see whatever was on his face. The night of December 14th was when the first real test came. It wasn't the worst thing that would happen to them. That was still weeks away. But it was the first moment when the frontier stopped being a backdrop and became a direct threat. And it showed Callum something about Elise that he hadn't seen clearly yet. One of the horses, the roan mare. Clara, the one that had thrown Elise 3 times in the first weeks of riding lessons, had gotten through a gap in the corral fence in the night and was missing. Callum discovered this at 5 in the morning in the dark and the cold, 40 minutes before the weather turned. The temperature dropped another 15 degrees in the time it took him to saddle his horse, and by the time he'd tracked Clara's prints north into the rough ground beyond the second pasture, the wind had come up to the kind of speed that makes every exposed surface feel like a personal attack. He found the mare about a mile out, caught in a shallow ravine where she'd gone down into the snow and couldn't get proper footing to climb back up. She was cold and frightened and would not be managed easily, which meant he needed another hand. He got back to the ranch in the wind and the half-dark, and found Elise already in the barn, saddling the second horse with the grim competence she'd developed in 3 months of consistent work. She didn't say what happened or should I come. She just looked at him when he came through the barn door and said, "Where?" "North pasture, shallow ravine, maybe a mile. She's down." "You need someone to hold her head while you get her up?" "Yes." "Let's go then." He looked at her for a moment. The temperature outside was somewhere around 0 and dropping, and she had her good coat and her work gloves and the focused expression of someone who had already weighed the situation and decided and said, "It'll be rough out there." "I know what rough is," she said, and led the horse out of the barn. She was not wrong. The ride north in that wind was the kind of experience that strips away anything unnecessary: conversation, complaint, anything beyond the basic requirement of staying on the horse and moving in the right direction. Elise rode ahead of him for a stretch when the trail narrowed, and he watched her and saw the difference between the woman who'd fallen off Clara in the yard in September and the woman riding into a 0-degree wind at 5 in the morning without complaint. She wasn't graceful about it. She was hunched into the wind and her horse was fighting the weather and she was fighting back. But she was there. She was moving through it. They got Clara out of the ravine. It took the better part of an hour, the mare cold and scared and uncooperative, requiring the kind of patient management that exhausts you in the specific way that frightened animals exhaust you, not physically, but in the part of yourself that stays calm on purpose. Elise held the horse's head through 2 near kicks, and one moment when Clara thrashed sideways hard enough to knock Elise into the snowbank, and she came up from the snow, spit ice, and went straight back to the horse's head without stopping. "You all right?" he called. "Fine," she said. "Hold her flank. I've got the front." They got her up. They walked her back in the weather, one on each side, and got her into the barn and checked her legs for damage and covered her with blankets. And by then it was close to 7 in the morning, and both of them were the kind of cold that takes hours to leave. In the kitchen afterward, with coffee and the fire going, Elise sat across from him with her hands wrapped around her cup and her hair still damp from the snow and said nothing for a while. Then, "She's all right?" "She'll be fine. The fence gap is the real problem. Needs fixing before another night." "I can do that this afternoon." "Peterson will do it." "Peterson's got the east barn roof to finish. I can do the fence." He looked at her. Her knuckles were white around the cup and she had the careful posture of someone managing discomfort. Her shoulder, probably, from when the mare had knocked her sideways. She wouldn't say so. He knew that already. "Elise," he said, "it's a fence repair. I know how to do fence repair now." A beat. "Your shoulder." "It's fine." "Is it?" She looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the fire moved in the grate, and the wind outside pushed at the walls of the house the way it always did, looking for the place to get in, and didn't find one. "I'm not fragile," she said. Not defensively, just placing the fact on the table. "I know that," he said. "I've known that since October." She looked at him a moment longer, reading whatever was in his face with that thoroughness she brought to reading everything. Then she nodded once and drank her coffee. He fixed the fence himself that afternoon. She didn't argue about it, mostly because by midday her shoulder had stiffened enough that she was moving carefully, and they both knew it. She spent the afternoon on the accounts and made supper, and did not thank him for taking the fence. And he did not expect thanks, and the evening passed the way their evenings had started to pass, with the particular settled quality of 2 people who have stopped pretending they don't know each other. That night he sat by the fire long after she'd gone to bed, listening to the wind work at the house, and thought about what she'd said that morning at the ravine. "I know what rough is." Not a boast, not a performance, just a statement of fact from someone who had been tested enough times to know what she was made of. He thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train in September with her violin case, and her impossible trunks, and her immediate questions, and her complete refusal to be what anyone had expected her to be. He thought about all the ways this valley had pushed against her in the past 3 months, all the ways the frontier tested what it got, looking for the weak seam, the place where things gave way. She hadn't given way. He sat there in the firelight, alone in the room that had slowly acquired her books, and her music, and her presence, and felt something settle in his chest. Not the stone anymore, but something quieter. Something that felt uncomfortably like certainty. He'd been treating this arrangement as a practical matter because that was the only framework he'd trusted himself with. But practical arrangements didn't make you ride into a 0-degree wind at 5 in the morning to check on a woman you'd sent out to get a frightened horse. Practical arrangements didn't make you build shelves. They didn't make you listen to violin music in the evening and feel, for the first time in years, that the house you lived in was actually inhabited. He sat with all of that for a long time in the dying firelight. He didn't say anything to her, not yet. There was still too much winter left, and the thing he felt was too new to trust with words. But when he finally went upstairs and passed her door and heard her even breathing in the dark, he stopped for just a moment with his hand against the doorframe, and the house around him felt solid in a way it hadn't before she'd come, and the wind outside was just wind. The rise survived December. It shouldn't have. The temperature in the 3rd week dropped to levels that killed hardier things than experimental grain rows, but the south-facing slope held just enough warmth during the brief daylight hours to keep the soil from freezing solid beneath the surface. And when Elise crouched over the rows on the morning of December 28th with a small trowel and dug carefully beside one of the stalks, the root structure underneath was intact. She sat back on her heels in the snow and looked at the living root in her cold hand and said nothing for a long time. Callum was watching from a few feet away. He'd come out to check the water trough and had stopped. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. She set the root carefully back and pressed the soil around it. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Not triumph, something quieter than that, more like relief. Like someone who'd argued for something they believed in and had been afraid of being wrong. I understood that feeling. He just never expected to recognize it in someone else. January came in like a door slamming. The temperature on the second day of the new year hit 31 below zero at dawn, and the sky turned a color that old-timers in Broken Creek called bone white, which was their way of saying that what was coming was not an ordinary storm. Callum had seen that sky once before, in the winter of 1886, which was the winter that had emptied 3 ranches in the valley permanently and put 2 more into debt they never recovered from. He remembered it the way you remember things that scare you when you're young, not as a memory exactly, but as a feeling in the body, a recognition. I was up before 4 on the morning of January 3rd, standing at the window, looking at the bone-white sky. Elise appeared at the top of the stairs behind him. She'd heard him moving and had that quality she had, the ability to come awake quickly, without the long fog that slowed most people in the cold dark. "What is it?" she asked. "Storm coming. Big one." He didn't turn from the window. "Not today. Maybe tomorrow. The sky's wrong." She came down the stairs and stood beside him and looked at the same sky. "How bad?" "Bad, bad," he paused. "The kind of bad where you lose animals if they're not sheltered properly. Maybe the kind where you lose people." She was quiet for a moment, reading the sky the way she'd learned to read everything out here, with full attention, not pretending to understand more than she did. "What do we do?" "We move cattle. Today, before it hits. Get them as close to the barn and the rock breaks as possible, and I need to think about shelter." "The sheds?" "Not enough. Not for 340 head in a real blizzard." He said it flatly, the way he said things he'd already accepted but hadn't solved yet. She heard the flatness. She knew by now what it meant. It meant he was running numbers in his head and the numbers weren't working. She went to the kitchen and came back with the agricultural journal she'd been reading since November. The one from the Norwegian farming cooperative that detailed winter livestock management in severe climates. She'd bookmarked a section weeks ago, for no reason she'd articulated, just because something in it had lodged in her mind. She opened it to that page and set it on the table. "Canyon shelters," she said. "Temporary structures using the natural windbreak of the rock face, reinforced with packed snow walls on the open sides. The Norwegians use them in the fjord valleys. The principle is, we're not in Norway. The wind mechanics are the same." She put her finger on the diagram. "The canyon ridge on the north boundary. The rock face runs east to west for nearly a quarter mile. If we build snow walls on the south and west sides, the rock takes the north wind entirely. You'd need to run emergency heating, fuel reserves. I know what I'd need." He looked at the diagram. His jaw was tight. "Elise, this is theoretical. This is a Norwegian pamphlet. It's an implemented system from 17 farms over 6 winters," she said. "The failure rate in sustained storms below 20 below was 4%. Your alternative is losing." She looked at the window, calculating, "conservatively, a third of the herd. That's what the 1886 numbers show for ranches that didn't shelter properly. I looked it up." He stared at her. "When did you look that up?" "October. When I was going through the valley's historical records at the county office." She met his eyes steadily. "I wanted to understand what the worst case looked like out here, so I'd know what we were preparing for." He looked at the diagram again. He looked at the bone-white sky. He looked at the woman standing across the table from him, who had apparently been quietly preparing for this exact situation since 2 months after she arrived. "How many hands do we need?" he said. She let out a breath that was not quite relief, not quite anything he had a name for. "Everyone you can get." They started before sunrise. Peterson came in early when Callum sent word, and the 2 seasonal hands they brought back for winter work. A taciturn Swede named Alvar, and a younger man called Decker, the same Decker who'd reconsidered his opinion of Elise after the autumn cattle drive, arrived by 7. Lars Maren from the neighboring property showed up unbidden at 7:30 because Lars Maren could also read a bone-white sky and had heard from Peterson what Callum was planning. And whatever he thought about women giving ranching advice, he was practical enough to recognize that Callum Voss's plan was better than standing in an open pasture watching his cattle freeze. "My brother-in-law's got a team and a sledge," Lars said when he arrived. "He can haul the fuel reserves if you need." "Tell him to come," Elise said before Callum could respond. She was already at the table with a rough map she'd drawn of the canyon ridge, working out positioning. "We'll need the sledge for the snow wall materials too." Lars looked at Callum. Callum looked at Lars. "She's right," Callum said simply, and that was the end of that conversation. They moved cattle for 6 straight hours in a wind that had started gentle and was building steadily toward something less forgiving. 340 animals do not move quickly or cooperatively, and cattle in early storm weather have a particular quality of collective stupidity. They drift away from where you're pushing them, they bunch wrong, they stop in bad places and won't be moved without sustained effort. Callum worked the east flank, Peterson and Alvar pushed from the west, and Elise and Decker managed the stragglers, which was the hardest work because stragglers went in every direction and required constant repositioning. She fell from her horse once, in the second hour, a hard fall, when her mare spooked sideways at a calf that bolted underfoot. She went down in the snow and came up in the automatic way of someone who has fallen enough times that falling has lost some of its indignity, and she caught the mare's reins and got back on in one motion and kept moving. Decker pulled his horse alongside her a few minutes later. "You sure you're—" "Move the Hereford Cross away from the north edge," she said, pointing. "She keeps drifting that direction and she'll take 3 others with her." Decker moved the Hereford Cross. By early afternoon, the cattle were concentrated in the canyon approach, and the snow wall construction had begun. It was brutal work, cutting and packing snow blocks in a wind that had reached 30 miles an hour and was still building, working in heavy coats that slowed every movement, hands that went numb every 15 minutes, and had to be forced back into function. Lars Maren's brother-in-law arrived with the sledge, and they ran 2 loads of fuel reserves up to the canyon, and Elise directed the wall positioning with the Norwegian diagram in her coat pocket, referring to it periodically with the unself-conscious practicality of someone who'd long since stopped caring how it looked to consult a piece of paper in the middle of a physical task. 3 feet thick minimum on the west wall, she told Decker and Alvar, who were packing. "It needs to hold in sustained wind. Don't rush the bottom course. That's where it fails." Alvar, who had not spoken more than 12 words total in 2 months of work, looked at her for a moment, then at the wall he was packing, then back at her. "She's right," he said, to no one in particular, and slowed down on the bottom course. By 4 in the afternoon, with the light failing and the wind at 40 miles an hour, the structure was as complete as they could make it. The fuel heaters were running, the cattle were inside the wind shadow of the canyon rock face with snow walls on 2 sides. And it was not a solution anyone would have called comfortable, but it was a solution. Callum stood at the entrance to the canyon shelter and looked at what they'd built. It was ugly and rough and entirely improvised from a Norwegian pamphlet and 300 feet of natural rock face, and it was standing in 40-mile-per-hour wind, and the animals inside it were alive and out of the worst of the weather. He turned and found Elise standing a few feet away, looking at the same thing. Her face was red from the cold, and she had ice crystals in her hair from where the snow had blown sideways, and she was doing the thing she did when she was assessing something, running the calculation in her head, looking for what she'd missed, what might still fail. "It'll hold?" he asked. "Not a challenge, a genuine question. The east corner is weaker than I'd like," she said. "We should check it every 4 hours through the night." She paused. "I'll take the 2 and 6 checks." "I'll take the 2, he said. "I said, I'll take the 2, he repeated with a flatness that was not negotiable, and she looked at him for a moment and then looked away and said nothing more about it. The storm hit fully at 9 that night. Callum had been in storms before, had been in the blizzard of 1886 as a young man and the hard winter of 92 that killed Bergstrom's prize bull and 3 of the Halverson cattle. But this one had a sustained quality that was different, a consistency of violence, wind and snow driving without pause in a way that made the previous storms feel intermittent by comparison. The house shook in the gusts. The fire in the grate guttered and recovered and guttered again. They sat up together because neither of them could sleep, and they didn't pretend otherwise. She'd brought out the agricultural journals, and he'd brought out the livestock ledger, and they worked at the table in a way that was partly practical, accounting for what they'd done and what they still might need to do, and partly just the human need to be near another person when the world outside is trying to make itself clear about your smallness. The Gustafsson place, she said at one point, not looking up. They didn't shelter their herd. He'd heard this from Peterson that afternoon. The Gustafsson family, 2 miles east, had decided the storm prediction was exaggerated and left their cattle in the open pasture. I know. There's nothing we can do about that now. No. She was quiet. I don't say that coldly. I just... She stopped. I know what you mean, he said. You can only manage your own ground. She looked at him. Did someone teach you that? The first winter taught me that, he said. Lost 8 head my second year here because I was trying to watch a neighbor's animals at the same time as mine. Neighbor left in April. Took nothing with him. He looked at the ledger page he wasn't really reading. You can't save everyone's operation. You can only be honest about what's yours to carry. She held that for a moment. That's a hard thing to know. Most useful things are. At midnight, he went out for the first check. The wind hit him the moment he opened the door with the specific malice of a blizzard that is committed to itself. Not cold you adjusted to, but cold that went straight past adjustment into something more fundamental. A cold that reminded you that your body was managing a narrow margin, and the margin could narrow further. He fought his way to the canyon in near zero visibility, following the rope line they'd strung between the house and the canyon entrance that afternoon specifically for this purpose. Elise's idea, which he'd implemented without comment. The east corner of the snow wall had partially given way. Not collapsed, the structure was intact, but the wind had found a weakness and pushed through it in a sustained stream that was dropping the temperature inside the shelter by several degrees. He repacked it in the dark and the wind, working by feel and lamplight, which was inadequate but what he had, and by the time he got back to the house he'd been outside for 40 minutes and his hands weren't working properly. Elise was at the door when he came in. She'd been watching for the lamp. She didn't say anything about the 40 minutes, just pulled him inside and had hot water on the stove and made him hold his hands over the steam, which hurt considerably more than the numbness had, and was correct. The east corner, he said, through the pane. I know. I could see from the window that you were over there longer. She kept his hands in the steam. Did it hold after you repacked? For now. We'll need to check it again. I'll go at 2. Elise? I'll go at 2, she said with a quiet finality, and he was too cold and too tired to argue the point. And she was right anyway. The 2 o'clock check needed to happen, and she was the only other person in the house. She went at 2. She was back in 25 minutes, which was fast, and when she came in and he met her in the kitchen, she was moving carefully, and there was something wrong with the way she was holding her left arm. What happened? He said. The east wall section gave way again, and I was repacking it, and the whole section shifted. It's fine, I got out of the way, but She stopped. Her face was very controlled in the way it got when she was managing something that hurt. My arm got caught between the wall and the rock for a moment. It's not broken. I checked the movement. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she let him take her arm without argument, which told him more about the pain level than her controlled expression did. He checked it himself. Not broken, she was right about that, but a bad bruise at minimum and possibly a strained muscle below the elbow, and her hands were the dangerous kind of cold. He sat her down and dealt with the hands first, the steam treatment, and she sat there and let him work and said nothing, and the storm outside shook the walls. The wall? He said. Repacked. The east face is holding. I braced it differently. She watched him work on her hands. I used the method from the 2nd chapter of the Norwegian manual. Angled compression instead of straight packing. It should be more stable. He looked up at her. You memorized the 2nd chapter. I memorized the relevant sections, she said, with a slight edge of defensiveness that told him she knew it sounded excessive and had decided not to care. He almost smiled. Almost. What? She said. Nothing. You were going to say something. I was going to say, he said carefully, that I'm glad you read the 2nd chapter. She looked at him for a moment with her hands still in the steam and her arm aching and her hair wild from the wind, and something moved through her expression. Not the controlled assessment she usually wore, something less managed than that. Are you? She said. Yes, he said, just that. The second night of the storm was the worst. The wind hit consistent gusts of nearly 60 miles an hour between 2 and 4 in the morning, and the snow was horizontal by then, and the canyon shelter's east wall gave way completely just after 3. Callum found out because he'd gone for the 4 o'clock check early on instinct and found the opening in the wall and the cattle pushing toward it with the directionless panic of animals in severe weather. What happened in the next 2 hours was not something he could have managed alone. Elise appeared 20 minutes after he did because she'd seen his lamp moving wrong through the window and had known. She came out in the full storm with a rope around her waist and her arm taped and her jaw set like someone who had weighed the cost and paid it already, and she went to the far side of the breach and worked toward him while he worked toward her, packing and driving cattle back from the opening simultaneously, which required the specific kind of coordination that comes from knowing how the other person moves. They rebuilt that section of wall in the worst weather either of them had ever worked in. It took 90 minutes. His hand stopped working twice, and he stopped being able to feel his feet at some point in the second hour. And he could see from the way she was moving that her arm was causing her real pain, and she was past the point of managing it invisibly. But she kept working. He found her at the far edge of the repaired section, on her knees in the snow, after they'd sealed the last gap. She'd gone down not dramatically, not in collapse, just the knees giving out, that specific exhaustion that the body communicates by simply stopping. She was conscious, looking at the wall they'd built, and the snow was coming down on her and she hadn't moved to get up. He reached her in 4 steps and went down beside her and put his arm around her, and she didn't resist it, which was how he knew how tired she was. She leaned against him with the full weight of a person who has used everything they had, and the storm screamed around the canyon walls, and he held on. "It's holding," she said. Her voice was steady but thin. "It's holding," he confirmed. She didn't move for a long moment. Neither did he. The cattle behind the repaired wall had settled, that collective animal quiet that meant the immediate terror had passed. The wind was still brutal, but the structure was standing, and the animals were alive, and the 2 people crouched against the rock face in the Dakota dark had done what they'd come out to do. He had his arm around her and her weight against his side and his face close to her cold hair, and the feeling in his chest was not the complicated stone it had been in December or the quieter certainty of the firelight nights. It was simpler than that, and it was terrifying in its simplicity. He did not say it. This was not the moment. She was exhausted and hurting and half frozen, and words spoken in extremity deserved better conditions than this. But he knew it. In the specific, honest way that very cold and very tired and very close to losing something makes you honest, he knew it completely. He got her back to the house. He got them both inside and warm by slow degrees the way you have to do it, careful and methodical, because you could hurt someone warming them too fast from that depth of cold. He made her sit by the fire and he checked her arm properly, and it was worse than she'd said but manageable, and he made coffee and neither of them spoke for a long time. The storm ran its 3rd night and exhausted itself sometime before dawn on the 5th of January. When the wind finally dropped to something ordinary, the silence it left behind had the quality of a held breath released, enormous and sudden and disorienting after the sustained violence of the previous hours. Callum went out with the first gray light and walked to the canyon. The snow walls were standing, the cattle were cold and hungry and alive, every single one of them. He stood there in the new quiet, in the wreckage of the worst storm the valley had seen in years, and looked at what 2 people in a Norwegian pamphlet had kept alive through 3 nights of sustained impossible weather. He heard her behind him, before he heard her footsteps. She moved quietly, even in snow boots. And she came to stand beside him and looked at the same thing he was looking at. Neither of them spoke for a while. 340, she said finally. 340, he confirmed. The morning light was coming up pale and flat across the white land, the way Dakota light came up in January. Without warmth, without drama, just the steady return of visibility after dark. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was just real, and present, and theirs. He turned and looked at her profile in that flat light. The bruise forming along her jaw where something had caught her in the storm, the arm she was holding slightly careful, the tiredness in her eyes that went deep but hadn't taken anything essential with it. She was not all right in the immediate physical sense. She was completely herself, which was a different thing, and more important. He didn't say what he knew, not yet. But he stopped being careful about looking at her, and she noticed, and she didn't look away. The valley took stock of itself slowly in the days after the storm. Word traveled the way it always traveled in that part of Dakota. person to person, at the feed store counter, and along the frozen road between properties. And what the word said was this: the Gustafson family had lost 60% of their herd. The Bergland operation to the northwest had lost their entire winter hay reserve when two storage structures collapsed under the snow weight. Old man Halverson, whose nod of approval had carried such weight in autumn, had lost 23 head to exposure before he could move them to adequate shelter. And he was not a man who lost animals easily or without cost. And the Voss Ranch had lost none. Not one animal. The Canyon Shelter story. Spread with the particular momentum that practical miracles generate in communities built on the edge of survival. People needed to know how it had been done because they needed to know it could be done, because the alternative was that the frontier simply won sometimes, and there was nothing to be learned from it. Callum found himself retelling the structure and method to 3 different men before the end of the first week after the storm, and each time he told it, he said the same thing without being asked. It was Elise's plan. The Norwegian pamphlet, the angled compression on the walls. He said it plainly because it was true, and because he was not a man who took credit for other people's thinking. Lars Maren came by on the 8th of January with his hat in his hands, an expression that sat somewhere between gratitude and embarrassment, which was the specific expression of a man acknowledging that a woman he'd been quietly skeptical of had just saved his judgment from being worse than it was. His brother-in-law's help during the shelter construction had protected his own cattle alongside Callum's, and Lars knew it. "I want to talk to her," he said to Callum at the door. "If that's all right." "That's her business, not mine," Callum said. "Come in." Elise was at the table with the livestock ledger, updating the winter records, her arm in the cloth wrap she'd been wearing for a week while the muscle healed. She looked up when Lars came in and waited, with the neutral patience of someone who lets other people find their own words. Lars found them eventually. "The shelter method," he said. "I want to understand it better, for next time." "Sit down," she said, and pulled out the Norwegian journal. She spent 2 hours with Lars Maren that afternoon, going through the construction principles, the positioning logic, the fuel reserve calculations. Callum came in and out of the kitchen during that time on legitimate ranch business, and each time he passed through he caught fragments of the conversation. Her voice precise and patient, Lars asking questions that started skeptical and gradually became specific and practical, which was the sequence a man went through when he was genuinely trying to learn something instead of looking for reasons to dismiss it. When Lars left, he shook Elise's hand. Not the brief, uncertain handshake of a man being polite to a woman he didn't quite know how to categorize. A real one. She watched him ride out through the kitchen window. Then she went back to the livestock ledger without comment, and Callum sat down across from her and looked at her for a moment. "You could charge for that," he said. She glanced up. "For what?" "The consultation, what you just did with Lars." She looked at him for a moment as though she wasn't sure if he was serious. "He's a neighbor." "He's a neighbor who's going to do exactly what you told him, and it's going to save him money and animals next winter." He paused. "There are 8 other operations in this valley who need the same conversation. They can come have it," she said. "Most of them won't ask, not on their own." She set down her pencil. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that you know things that are useful to people out here. You've been sharing that freely since you arrived. The drainage advice to Lars, the hay purchasing timing you mentioned to Peterson's cousin, the winter crop rows that are sitting under the snow right now still alive. People are going to start coming to you whether you arrange for it or not. Might as well be deliberate about it." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the journal on the table. He could see her thinking. Not reluctance exactly, but the careful habit of a person who has learned to measure how much space she's allowed to take up before checking whether it's welcome. "The valley doesn't particularly like me telling it what to do," she said. "Parts of the valley tried that position for about 3 months, and then a blizzard settled the argument," he said. Something shifted in her expression. The faint movement that he'd learned was as close as she got to a genuine smile when she was caught off guard by something. "That's a little blunt." "I've been working on saying things directly," he said. "I'm told it's a useful habit." She looked at him then. Really looked, the way she had in the canyon in the storm, with none of the managed distance she'd kept in the early weeks. "Who told you that?" "Someone who arrived here with 2 heavy trunks and no patience for indirect communication," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and something warm moved through her expression before she controlled it, and she looked back down at the ledger. But the corner of her mouth held the shape of what she wasn't saying, and he saw it, and he said nothing more, but he felt the kitchen around him the way he'd started feeling rooms when she was in them. Present, inhabited, real. It was 2 days later that Vernon Hale arrived in Broken Creek, and the valley's slow recovery from the storm collided with something considerably less natural. Hale was not from the territory. He was from St. Paul, Minnesota, where he ran a land brokerage that operated in the specific margin between struggling families and the people who wanted their land. A margin that expanded usefully every time a bad winter reduced a rancher's options and contracted his willingness to fight. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had learned that money was more durable than muscle, and he arrived in a good coat with a portfolio of documents and a manner that was impeccably courteous right up until the moment it needed to be something else. Callum heard about him first from Peterson, who'd been in town and overheard the conversation Hale had with the man who ran the county land records office. Hale had been asking specific questions about which properties in the valley were behind on tax assessments, which operations had taken losses in the storm, and who held the notes on the smaller homesteads. "He's building a list," Peterson said. "Of what?" Callum asked. "Of who's in trouble." Peterson paused. "The Berglund family. Their 2 sons went to the county office yesterday asking about extension on their assessment. Hale was there at the same time." Callum thought about this for the rest of the day. That evening he told Elise what Peterson had said, straight through without editorializing, and let her hear it the same way he'd heard it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was organizing the information rather than reacting to it. "How many families in the valley are behind on assessments right now?" "After this storm? Probably 5 or 6 at minimum. The Berglunds for certain. Probably the Gustafsson place. They lost too much stock to recover their operating margin this season. Maybe the Lindqvist homestead on the west boundary. And if someone bought those notes, they'd control whether those families stayed or went." She looked at the fire. "Has this happened before? In this valley?" "Not here. I've heard of it happening in the Eastern Territories. Man comes in after a bad year, buys distressed notes at discount, forecloses when the families can't pay. Ends up with 5, 6 adjoining properties for a fraction of their value." He paused. "Then sells them consolidated to a railroad concern or a large cattle corporation. Who benefits from the consolidated land? Whoever Hale works for. He's not doing this for himself. That portfolio and that coat cost more than a single land deal pays." Elise turned this over in silence for long enough that the fire had burned down a visible measure before she spoke again. "The families need to know what he's doing before he approaches them individually," she said. "Once he has them in a private conversation, one at a time, with documents in front of them, and a figure that sounds reasonable given how frightened they are, it's harder to say no. People don't like being told someone's taking advantage of them. Makes them feel foolish. Then don't say it that way." She looked at him. "Say, here's information, here's what it means, here's what your options are." She paused. "And you need to be the one to say it, Callum, not me. They'll hear it from you in a way they won't hear it from me. I'm still the woman with the Norwegian pamphlet as far as half this valley is concerned." He looked at her steadily. "And if the information includes that there's an alternative, a cooperative arrangement that lets the smaller operations pool risk without giving up their land." She met his eyes. "Is there one?" "Not yet," he said. "But there could be." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you been thinking about that?" "Since October," he said. "Since you started talking about why small operations fail in bad years when larger ones survive." He held her gaze. "You planted the idea. I've been thinking about what the ground looks like." Something moved through her face. Not just the controlled warmth he'd been seeing more of in recent weeks, but something deeper, a recognition of being heard in a way she hadn't been prepared for. She looked away first, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. "Then we have work to do," she said when she looked back, "before he has those private conversations." Hale made his first approach 4 days later. He came to the Voss Ranch directly, which was either confidence or miscalculation, and Callum received him in the yard with Elise standing 3 feet to his right, which was not accidental positioning on anyone's part. Hale absorbed Elise's presence with the brief recalibration of a man encountering something he hadn't accounted for, and then he recovered and was very courteous. He had a proposal, he said. Given the hardship of the season, given the pressures on smaller operations throughout the valley, he represented investors who were prepared to offer fair value for land that its current owners might find burdensome to maintain going forward. He used the word burdensome twice. He had a portfolio of assessment documents that he did not open, but made sure was visible. Callum let him finish. Then he said, "Which families have you already spoken to?" A pause. "I haven't yet had the opportunity. Which families are you planning to approach?" Hale looked at him with the patient expression of a man recalibrating more significantly. "Mr. Voss, I'm simply offering I know what you're offering," Callum said. He was not loud. He was not aggressive. He used the same flat, permanent tone he used when a fence needed to be a fence and was not going to move. "And I'm going to be in town on Thursday at the Halverson Meeting Hall with every ranching family in this valley, and I'm going to explain what that offer looks like from the other side. You're welcome to come and make your case directly." Hale looked at him for a long moment, then at Elise, who had not said a word and did not now, but who met his assessment with the complete composure of someone who has already run the numbers and found them adequate. "That's a bold position for a man whose neighbors' opinions haven't always been favorable to his household," Hale said. It was said pleasantly. It was a threat dressed in courtesy, which was the only kind of threat he used. "My neighbors' opinions changed," Callum said. "You got here a little late to work with the old ones." Hale left. He drove back toward town at the same measured pace he'd arrived at, and neither Callum nor Elise said anything until the wagon was out of sight along the trail. Then Elise said quietly, "We need the cooperative framework written down before Thursday. Clearly, numbers, terms, how the shared risk works." "I know. I can have a draft by tomorrow evening if you give me what you know about each family's operating situation." "I can do that tonight." She turned toward the house, then stopped. "What you said to him? About the neighbors' opinions?" She didn't finish the sentence immediately. "It's true," he said. "I know it's true." She paused. "I just didn't know you saw it that way." "I've seen it for a while," he said. "I wasn't sure it needed saying out loud before now." She nodded once and went inside, and he stood in the yard for a moment in the cold January light that was coming back now, day by day, a little more each afternoon, and felt something uncomplicated and solid in his chest that he recognized as being in the right place doing the right thing. The Thursday meeting was not elegant. Elegant was not a quality that Thursday meetings in Dakota Territory possessed, and this one had the additional complication of containing people who were frightened and proud in equal measure, which was the specific combination most resistant to receiving help gracefully. The Halverson Hall held 22 people, ranchers, their wives, 2 adult sons from different families who'd come to represent their fathers, and Jorgen Halt from the grain elevator, who was there because he was always there when things were happening, and nobody had ever found a way to discourage him. Callum stood at the front of that room and talked about what he knew. He was not a practiced speaker. He used plain sentences and took pauses when he needed them, and did not apologize for either of these things. He told them what he knew about Hale's methods from what he'd heard and observed. He told them what the consolidated land deals had looked like in the Eastern Territories. He told them what a cooperative cattle network could look like. Shared risk on the herd insurance assessments, shared access to emergency resources, shared negotiating position on hay and feed prices. And he used the numbers Elise had worked out the previous 2 evenings, presented on a single sheet of paper that he'd had Peterson copy out in enough quantity for the room. Bergstrom sat in the 3rd row with his arms crossed for the first 20 minutes. Then he uncrossed them. He didn't say anything supportive, but the uncrossed arms meant he was listening rather than waiting for his turn to object, which was progress. Old Halverson asked 3 sharp questions about the liability structure. Callum answered 2 of them directly, and the third he said, "I don't know the legal specifics yet, but I know someone who can find them out." And he did not look at Elise when he said it, though she was sitting in the 2nd row with the working draft of the cooperative framework on her lap. Lars Marin's brother-in-law, who had helped haul fuel reserves in the storm, and had therefore already voted with his labor on whose side he was on, said loudly from the back, "I'm in," which broke something open in the room. Not enthusiasm exactly, but the specific loosening that happens when the first person says the thing everyone else was waiting to hear someone else say first. Hale was there. He'd come, as Callum had said he was welcome to. He sat against the wall and listened, and did not speak until the room was already 3/4 persuaded, and then he made his case with the same courteous competence he brought to everything, and it was a good case, genuinely. He was not a stupid man, but it was a case built on individual fear, and the room was no longer as afraid as it had been when it walked in. When the meeting ended, 7 families had signed the cooperative framework in draft form. 4 more said they needed to think. 3 said nothing definitive. Bergstrom, on his way out, stopped beside Callum and stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands. The woman put the numbers together, he said. Not hostile, factual. She did, Callum said. Bergstrom looked at the floor and then at Callum. The canyon shelter worked, he said. Yes, it did. I heard. He put his hat on. Tell her. The framework numbers are solid. The risk distribution on the second tier is better than I would have done it. He walked out before Callum could respond. Callum stood in the emptying hall and held that for a moment. Then he found Elise gathering the remaining paper copies from the chairs, and he told her what Bergstrom had said, word for word, because she deserved to hear it word for word and not summarized. She stopped gathering papers. She stood there with a small stack of them in her hands and looked at nothing in particular for a moment, and he could see something move through her that she was managing with less success than usual. Not tears. Elise didn't cry in front of people, but something close to the cellular level of what tears are made of. That's... she started. I know, he said. She pressed her lips together and went back to gathering the papers with her usual efficiency, and he helped her without being asked, and they walked out of the Halverson Hall together into the cold January evening with 7 signed agreements and a cooperative that didn't quite exist yet but was closer than it had been that morning. On the ride back to the ranch in the dark, she said, Hale will try another approach. He won't stop because of one meeting. I know that. He'll look for the weakest family in the agreement and apply pressure there. Try to peel one off. Probably the Berglands. They're the most frightened. We should talk to them before he does. Tomorrow, he said. She nodded. The wagon moved through the dark at the steady pace of horses that knew the road home, and the stars over Dakota were the specific sharp and numerous stars that only appeared in clear, cold air, and Elise sat beside him with the signed agreements in her lap and her shoulder near his, not quite touching. He moved slightly so that it was. She didn't move away. Neither of them said anything about it. The horses knew the road. The stars did what stars did. The valley spread out around them in the dark, 7 families strong now. In a way it hadn't been that morning, and the Voss Ranch sat ahead of them in the distance with its lit window and its bookshelf walls, and the green rye sleeping under the January snow, waiting for a spring that was still weeks away but was, without question, coming. He'd been alone in this valley for 11 years. He'd learned the land, learned the weather, learned the particular calibration of survival that the frontier demanded. He thought he understood what he was doing out here. He was starting to understand that he'd only known half of it. They went to see the Berglands the next morning. The Bergland homestead sat 4 miles south of the Voss Ranch on a piece of land that was good ground, well-drained, decent grass, the kind of property that a man could build something real on if the weather cooperated and his luck held for a few consecutive years. The trouble was that Eric Bergland's luck had not held. Not for 3 years running. The summer drought of the year before had cut his hay yield by 1/3. The autumn had been expensive with a sick bull that needed the veterinarian twice. And then the January storm had taken 2 of his storage structures and most of what was inside them, and now he was sitting on a property with a spring operating season in front of him and not enough reserves to meet it. I was 44 years old and he looked 60 that morning when he opened the door. His wife, Marta, was behind him. A small, solid woman with the enduring expression of someone who had been managing fear quietly for long enough that quiet had become her default setting. She looked at Callum and then at Elise with the specific assessment of a woman taking inventory of who was on her doorstep and whether they were there to help or to complicate things further. Come in, Eric said, with the flat hospitality of a man who has been raised to be courteous even when courtesy costs him something. They sat at the Bergland kitchen table, which was the same kitchen table that every conversation of consequence happened at in that valley, and Callum laid out what he knew about Hale's intentions with the directness he'd committed himself to. Not softened, not dramatized, just the information and what it meant. Eric listened with his hands flat on the table, looking at the surface. Marta stood at the stove and listened without moving. When Callum finished, Eric was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He came yesterday afternoon." Callum looked at him. "Hale." "Yes." Eric's jaw moved. The figure he offered, it's not unfair given what the property's been valued at. That's the thing. It's not an insult. He looked up. It's just enough to leave with something instead of nothing. And if you stay, Callum said. If I stay, I need to cover the spring assessment and restock the feed reserves and replace what the storm took. He said it with the exhaustion of someone who has done this calculation many times. I don't have the capital for all of it. I might have enough for most of it if the spring goes well and I don't lose anything else. He paused. That's a lot of conditions. Elise had been quiet through all of this. Now she set a piece of paper on the table. The cooperative framework, the same document that 7 families had signed the night before. She didn't push it toward him. She just put it there and let him look at it. The risk distribution on Tier 2, she said. The Emergency Reserves Fund. If you're in the cooperative before the spring assessment, your individual exposure on the operating cost drops by roughly 30%. It doesn't fix everything, but it changes the calculation. Eric looked at the paper. He looked at the numbers in the way of a man who understands numbers and is running them in real time. Who's in this? Callum told him. 7 names. The weight of each name was different. Halverson's name carried the most because Halverson had been in the valley the longest and had come through the most. And when Eric heard Halverson's name on the list, something shifted in his face. He signed, Eric said. He did. Eric looked at his wife. Marta looked back at him with an expression that was not a decision. The decision was his to make. She was communicating that she knew it, but it was something close to permission. Or maybe just the recognition that they had already been through the worst of it together and were still standing, which was its own kind of answer. Let me think on it, Eric said. Take the time you need, Callum said. But don't let Hale have a second conversation before you've thought it through. They left the Berglands and drove back through the cold morning, and halfway home Elise said, He'll sign. You think so? Halverson's name did it. She looked at the road ahead. He needed to know that someone who'd seen everything and survived everything still thought it was worth staying. Callum thought about that. What made you stay? He said. It came out differently than he'd intended. More direct, more personal. And he felt it the moment it left him, but he didn't take it back. She didn't answer immediately. The horses moved. The road was rutted with refreezing, and the wagon complained about it. I didn't come here with a lot of good options, she said finally, with the plainness she used when she was being completely honest. You know that, the agency, the letter. That was practical. I was 28 years old with a good education and no money and a country that had run out of space for what I was. She paused. But I stayed, past the point where it was just practical, because this place turned out to be real. The work is real. The problems are real. When you fix something here, it stays fixed, or it breaks again honestly, and you fix it again. She looked at the horizon. I've lived in places where nothing was real, where everything was performance and position, and who you knew. She shook her head slightly. I'd rather be cold and real than warm and hollow. He sat with that for a long moment. The ranch came into view ahead of them, the solid line of the house against the winter sky, the barn and outbuildings behind it, the south slope where the rye was sleeping under the snow. That's not the only reason, he said. He wasn't sure what made him say it. Something in the way she'd stopped her own sentence. She looked at him, a pause. No, she said quietly. It's not the only reason. Neither of them said anything more until they pulled into the yard, and she got down from the wagon before he could come around, the same way she'd gotten down at this ranch the very first day she'd arrived. But it was not the same gesture it had been then. It was not independence performed for an audience. It was just how she moved, and he knew the difference now. He unhitched the horses, and she went inside, and he stood in the yard for a moment longer than necessary. Hale made his second approach 2 weeks later, and it was not to the Berglands. It was to Bergstrom. This was more sophisticated than the first approach, and Callum had to give the man credit for the intelligence of it. Bergstrom was not a struggling operation. He was the largest landowner in the valley after Callum, and his signature on anything carried weight. What Hale offered him was not a distress purchase, but a partnership. A consulting arrangement with the investment concern behind Hale, a premium price for a portion of Bergstrom's land along the eastern boundary, and the implicit suggestion that men who worked with the incoming capital rather than against it would find themselves considerably better positioned when the valley's ownership structure finished consolidating. Bergstrom came to Callum with this. Not because he was going to accept it, Callum understood that when he arrived, saw the expression, but because he was going to refuse it and wanted someone to know he had. He's smart, Bergstrom said. He's not wrong that the capital behind him is real. These people have money. He sat at the kitchen table which was where everyone sat, and he had the look of a man who has been genuinely tempted by something and is more unsettled by that than by anything else. It would have been easier if the offer was obviously bad. Good offers are harder to say no to, Elise said from across the table. She'd been there when Bergstrom arrived and she'd stayed, and Bergstrom had not asked her to leave, which was a different relationship than they'd had in October. Yes, he said. He looked at her. The framework, the cooperative, it runs to what timeline? Ongoing, she said. There's no exit structure built yet for members who want to leave. That was deliberate. We can add one. I don't want to leave. He said it like a man who has decided something and wants to hear himself say it. I want to know it's structured to last. Then help us structure it to last, she said. You've been in this valley longer than almost anyone. You know what failed before and why. That information is worth more than your signature. Bergstrom looked at her for a long moment. The same man who had told Callum in November that he'd let her run too loose, that she'd cause problems, that this wasn't Milwaukee. He had the grace to understand the distance between that man and the one sitting at this table now. All right, he said. Tell me what you need. What followed was 6 weeks of work that was less dramatic than the storm and no less exhausting. The cooperative framework had to become a real document, legally workable, clearly structured, fair enough that the families who'd signed in the first rush of Thursday's meeting didn't start finding reasons to back out when the immediate danger of Hale's presence faded and the ordinary reluctance to commit to something permanent reasserted itself. Elise drafted and redrafted. Callum reviewed and challenged and pushed back on the sections where the language was too optimistic or the liability distribution too clean to be real. Bergstrom contributed 20 years of memory about how the valley actually functioned, which relationships were solid and which were polite fictions, which families would carry their weight and which would need watching. Hale made 2 more approaches to individual families during this period. He got one of them, a young couple, the Svenssons, who'd been in the valley less than 2 years and didn't have the roots to feel what they were leaving. They sold and were gone by March. Callum didn't blame them. 2 years wasn't enough time to know whether you were a person who belonged in a place or a person who'd just been visiting, and sometimes you only found out by leaving. Everyone else held. Eric Berglund signed the cooperative agreement on a Tuesday in February, and Marta Berglund served coffee afterward. And it was not a ceremonial moment. The kitchen was cluttered, the coffee was too strong, and one of the Berglund children came through twice asking questions about a missing boot. But it was real, which was worth more than ceremony. By April, the cooperative had 12 member families. The Shared Emergency Reserve Fund had enough in it to cover a significant operating shortfall for any single member. The hay purchasing agreement, timed as Elise had suggested, bought collectively in early summer before the autumn demand drove prices, was projecting savings across the membership that would amount, in aggregate, to something between $800 and $1,000 for the season. Hale left Broken Creek in March. He didn't announce his departure. He was simply there 1 week and not the next, and the room at the boarding house was taken by a traveling schoolteacher who had no interest in land acquisition and considerably more interest in whether the town could support a proper school. The valley breathed differently after he left. Not relaxed exactly. The frontier didn't allow relaxation as a sustained condition, but settled. Like a house after a bad winter, assessing what held and what needed repair and finding that more had held than expected. The rye came up in April. Not all of it. The hardest weeks in January had taken maybe a third of what Elise had planted, but 2/3 of the rows pushed up green and purposeful through the thawing soil, and she stood over them on the first morning she found them clearly growing and said nothing for a long time. Callum stood beside her and also said nothing, because this was one of those moments that words would only reduce. Then she said, "We can scale it next year. The south and east slopes both have compatible soil conditions. If we expand the planting area in September—" "Elise," he said. She stopped. "Just look at it for a minute," he said, "before you plan the next thing." She looked at him, and then she looked back at the green rows in the April soil, and something in her shoulders came down slightly. The constant forward-leaning readiness that she carried so habitually she probably didn't know she was carrying it, and she just looked at the thing they'd grown. "It worked," she said quietly. "It worked," he said. She stood there in the morning light with the Montana wind moving her hair, and she was not composed in the careful way she was usually composed, and the tiredness of the whole winter was visible in her face along with something else. Satisfaction, maybe, or the specific feeling of having been right about something that mattered and having paid the price to find out. He had been working out how to say something for 3 months. He was not a man who found words easily, had never been, and the words for this particular thing were harder than most because they were the kind that couldn't be taken back, and he didn't want to take them back, which made the saying of them the most consequential thing he'd done since he wrote a letter to a Chicago agency and set this whole chain of events in motion. "I need to tell you something," he said. She turned to look at him. Whatever she heard in his voice made her go very still. "When I wrote that letter to the agency," he said, "I was looking for an arrangement, something practical. I wrote out what I needed, like I was writing a supply order, and I thought, if I'm honest, I thought that feelings weren't going to be part of it, that feelings were what made men foolish, and I'd been alone long enough to be past them." She was watching him with the full attention she brought to things that mattered. Not the assessment attention, the cataloging kind. Something else. "I was wrong about that," he said. "You know I was wrong about that. I think you've known it longer than I have." He paused. "I love you. I'm not saying it the way a man says something he's obligated to say. I'm saying it because it's the most accurate thing I know about my own life right now, and I've been carrying it around since January, and I'm not built for carrying things I don't say." The field was quiet around them. The rye moved in the wind. Elise looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she'd been reading him since September, but without the careful distance she'd kept in those early months. Then she said, "You are genuinely the most aggravating man I have ever met." He blinked. "I have been waiting," she said, with a precision that suggested she had thought about this exact speech at some point, "since November, for you to say something. Since the kitchen. Since the canyon. Since approximately every evening we've spent at that table for the past 4 months." She stopped. Then quieter. "I was starting to think I'd imagined all of it." "You didn't imagine it," he said. "I know that now," she said, "because you just said it out loud, which apparently required the entire winter to accomplish. I said I was working on saying things directly. I didn't say I was fast at it." She looked at him with an expression that was exasperated and warm and entirely unguarded, which was the most complete version of her face he'd ever seen, and then she stepped toward him and put her hand flat on his chest, the way she'd put her hand on the kitchen floor in September to demonstrate the cold coming up from the root cellar, direct, purposeful, making sure of something, and looked up at him. "I love you too," she said. "I've been in love with you since the first blizzard when you found me under that fence line and looked at me like losing me would be the thing you couldn't come back from." She paused. "I wasn't sure you knew that was what your face was doing." "I didn't," he admitted. "I know." The warmth in her expression shifted into something he recognized as tenderness, which was not a quality he'd associated with her in the early months, and which now seemed to him as central to her as the directness and the Norwegian pamphlets and the morning coffee she made without asking how he took it. "You're not always the most self-aware man." "I'm aware of that," he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, short and genuine, surprised out of her, and he felt it in his chest the way you feel something that belongs there. He put his hand over hers, where it was still pressed against his chest, and they stood in the April field with the green rye growing around them, and the frost finally, properly gone from the ground. And it was not a perfect moment. Her hair was tangled from the wind and he needed a shave, and somewhere behind them one of the horses was being demanding about breakfast. But it was entirely theirs, and it was real, and those two qualities were worth more than perfect had ever been. The years that followed were not easy. The frontier did not become gentle because two people had decided to face it together. It remained what it always was, large and cold and indifferent to human plans, willing to take animals and crops and structures and sometimes people regardless of how well those people had prepared. There were hard summers and harder winters. There were seasons when the cooperative's emergency reserve got used more than anyone wanted, and seasons when it sat untouched, and they almost forgot why they'd built it. There were arguments between Callum and Elise that were genuine arguments, not the careful, managed disagreements of early months, but the full-throated kind that two strong-willed people who know each other completely are capable of producing, and they had them in the kitchen and the barn, and once memorably in the middle of the north pasture, where Peterson had the grace to pretend he hadn't heard anything. They always came back to the same table. The ranch grew in the incremental, unglamorous way that real things grow, not in a single triumphant season, but year by year, decision by decision, the compound interest of small good choices made consistently over time. The winter crop program expanded to the east slope, then the south field, and within 4 years it was generating enough additional revenue to carry 2 full additional hands through the winter months. The cooperative had 23 member families by its 5th year and had successfully weathered 2 more difficult winters and 1 extended drought without losing a single member to forced sale. Bergstrom, who had started as the cooperative's most reluctant participant, became its most effective advocate with the neighboring valley operations, which was a turn of events that gave Elise a quiet satisfaction she expressed only to Callum, and only once, with a raised eyebrow and a single dry sentence. People change slower than rye, but they do change. The bookshelf expanded wall by wall through the years, the way Callum had promised it could on that first day when he'd looked at the wall and seen what it could become. The main room held 4 of them by the 5th year, and a 5th in the hallway, and the books on them were a record of everything Elise had been thinking about and working through. Agricultural science next to German poetry, next to Dakota territorial law, next to a well-worn Norwegian farming cooperative manual, with 4 different generations of margin notes. The violin music filled the valley on Sunday evenings, weather permitting. It had from the beginning, even in that first cautious winter when she'd played quietly and stopped when he came in the door. But now it carried differently, without hesitation, the window open in summer, so the sound went out across the grass. People passing on the road learned to expect it, and some of them, over time, began timing their Sunday travel to catch it. Children arrived with the same unplanned authenticity that most things arrived on a working ranch, not on schedule, not without complication, but decisively. Their daughter, born in the 3rd year, had Elise's gray-green eyes and Callum's absolute composure in the face of difficulty, which was a combination that would serve her well in the life she was being born into. Their son came 2 years after, and was neither composed nor quiet from his first day, and managed to be simultaneously the most exhausting and the most entertaining person on the property, which Peterson privately considered fair compensation for everything. The children grew up understanding that the land was not a backdrop. It was a participant. It had opinions and expressed them through weather and season and the condition of the grass and the behavior of the cattle. And if you paid attention to it, not with romanticism, but with genuine practical respect, it would tell you things you needed to know. Elise taught them this with the same combination of journal reading and direct observation she'd applied to everything since arriving on a train platform in September with 2 heavy trunks and a violin case. Callum taught them this by example, by the way he moved through the land every day, knowing it the way you know something you've spent years being honest with. They did not become legend in any theatrical sense. The Voss Ranch was not famous. It was known, which was different and more durable. Travelers crossing the Northern Territory knew it the way people know landmarks, not as a story to be told, but as a fixed point in the landscape, a thing that was where it was supposed to be, doing what it was supposed to do year after year. In a part of the world where most things were temporary, where the frontier ground through operations and families and ambitions with the same patient indifference it applied to everything, something that stayed and grew and held its shape across years was its own kind of remarkable. One evening in late autumn, several years deep into the life they'd built, they were sitting by the fire after supper in the way they always sat, him in his chair with whatever correspondence needed answering, her on the other side with whatever she was reading, the comfortable parallel occupation of 2 people who had long since stopped performing ease and had simply become it. The children were in bed. The fire moved in the grate. Outside, the Dakota wind ran across the plains the way it always had and always would, looking for the weak place in things. It didn't find one here. Elise set down her book and looked at the fire for a while. He noticed but didn't say anything, waiting. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked eventually. "The letter, the agency, the whole—" She made a small gesture that encompassed something too large for a single word. He looked at her. She was looking at the fire, her expression open in the particular way it got in these quiet evenings when she'd stopped managing it, when she was simply present, simply herself, the woman who had stepped off a train in September with no intention of being anyone's submissive anything and had ended up being, instead, the thing that held the center of this place. "The frontier gave me land," he said, "but you gave me a reason to stay." She turned to look at him. He meant it in the exact way it sounded, plainly, completely, without embellishment, because he had learned from a woman with no patience for hollow language that the most important things were always better said straight. She looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "That's the most words you've ever put together at once." "I've been working on it for years," he said. She smiled, A real one, the full kind that she'd stopped being careful about a long time ago, and picked up her book again, and the fire settled, and outside the wind did what it did, and inside the house that two people had made from a practical arrangement and stubbornness and bad weather and rye that grew against every expectation, the night passed the way good nights pass, quietly, warmly, with the particular completeness of a life that had been built instead of found. The thing that nobody who saw them together in those later years could quite articulate, and that Callum himself only understood in fragments, the way you understand things that are too close to see whole, was that what they had built was not a love story in the way that phrase usually meant. It was not a story about two people who were perfect for each other finding their way to each other despite obstacles. It was a story about two imperfect people who had each run out of the easier options and arrived in the same hard place and decided, separately and then together, that the hard place was worth the effort of staying. Elise had not come to Dakota to fall in love. She'd come because the world had offered her a narrow set of options, and she'd chosen the one that was at least honest about what it was asking of her. Callum had not sent for a wife because he was ready for one. He'd sent for one because 11 years of silence had finally accumulated to a weight he couldn't carry alone without it changing him into something he didn't want to become. Neither of them had been ready. Neither of them had arrived whole. The frontier had taken pieces from both of them over the years. The hard pieces, the brittle ones, the ones that were more performance than substance, and what was left was the actual material of who they were, which turned out to be sufficient. That was perhaps the only lesson the land had ever consistently taught the people who stayed long enough to receive it. Not that hard work was rewarded, because sometimes it wasn't. Not that love conquered difficulty, because difficulty was real, and love alone was not a functional answer to a collapsed snow wall at 3 a.m. But that people who were honest about what they were and what they needed, and who found another person honest in the same way, could build something that the weather couldn't take. Something that felt, at the end of the day, like the place you had been trying to get back to your whole life without knowing that was what you were doing. Something that finally, genuinely, completely felt like home.